Welcome back to Black Indians and Freedmen, the podcast. How are you, Dr. Christina Dickerson-Cousin?
I'm very well. How are you?
Doing well. We are in Chapter 7, so let's dive right in. So, where did we leave off with Chapter 6, and how does it inform Chapter 7?
Chapter 6 is the lengthiest chapter in the book because it deals with the infrastructure that the AME Church established in Indian Territory. So I look at the Indian Mission Annual Conference and how that is created. We looked at specific churches, schools, and publications. And so that chapter really demonstrates how deeply enmeshed the AME Church was in Indian Territory, so that by the time we get to Chapter 7, which is what we're talking about tonight, the AME Church's role in Indigenous communities is now clear. Because they have built and established this infrastructure, the AME Church and AME ministers specifically can be of service to Black Indigenous ministers during the Dawes Commission era. So really what Chapter 7 is looking at is how the AME Church played a role in this Dawes Commission era.
Speaking of, your section on the Dawes Commission begins on page 155. So please differentiate between the Dawes Act and the Dawes Commission. What were the intentions of Senator Henry Dawes, the man for whom the Dawes Act was named? And how did whites benefit from the Dawes Act?
Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts was a reformer who, at least in his mind, felt that he was assisting Native people. He believed that the best way to help Native people was to push them towards a more American style of living, which required them not holding land in common as they typically did, but rather having individual land ownership. And so he figured that if you push Native people to do that and have them have their individual farms for their own, nuclear families, that would ultimately push them towards civilization, as he defined it, and help them to better assimilate into American society. So from his point of view, this action was going to help. And so in 1887, the General Allotment Act, which is colloquially known as the Dawes Act, did just that. And it essentially forces Native tribes to allot their land. So instead of holding land in common, people are supposed to get these individual plots of land and become farmers and live in a more American style way. And so again, from his perspective, from Dawes' perspective, this was meant to help them better assimilate to American society. Now, the, of course, downside of this is that here again is the U.S. government imposing its vision of what Native people should be doing on Native people. And the fact that once these allotments were made, when there was land left over, as there of course was, that surplus land, as it was termed, was then available for white settlement. And so in this way, this became a major, form of land dispossession for Native people. And over the course of several decades, Native people lose millions of acres of land because of this allotment policy that Dawes thought was helping, but ultimately was very detrimental to Native communities. So that Dawes Act is passed in 1887, but initially this does not apply to the 5 civilized tribes because of previous treaties. And so in 1893, President Cleveland wants to get a commission together to try to convince the 5 civilized tribes to go along with allotment policy. And so this commission becomes known as the Dawes Commission. And so again, their purpose is to negotiate an allotment agreement with the 5 civilized tribes and start getting together citizenship roles. Because in order to determine who gets an allotment, you have to know who is officially a member of the tribe. And so this is what the Dawes Commission is doing. And I believe we'll get to it later, but essentially this is what this commission's work is. So the 1887 General Allotment Act is for Native people in general. And then the Dawes Commission was really specifically for the 5 civilized tribes.
Thank you for clarifying that. All right. So What was the Curtis Act of 1898? How did Congress determine who was a member of the five civilized tribes? And were Black Indians considered members of the five civilized tribes?
The Curtis Act of 1898 is essentially the allotment law for the five civilized tribes. And so they are essentially forced to go along with this allotment policy and start dividing up their land for individual, owners. And this, of course, is complicated because, as you alluded to, you now have to figure out who is officially a member of the tribe. And so this is what the Dawes Commission is doing. It is going to Indian Territory and holding these various meetings in which individuals will come in and be interviewed and present their paperwork to prove that they were members of these tribes. So essentially, the Dawes Commission would announce, okay, we're going to be in Fort Gibson today, we're going to be in Muskogee today, and if you want to apply for, citizenship in this official tribe and get on these Dawes rolls, then you have to come in. And so individuals would have to, again, show up and present their, personal testimony attesting to who they were. They could call in witnesses who could also attest to their status and who they were. And then they could provide paperwork such as, previous tribal citizenship rolls or anything else that could prove that they were who they said they were. Now, of course, this is problematic because here we have, yet again, a government entity essentially determining who is officially a member of an indigenous nation, a sovereign indigenous nation. And there are some within the five civilized tribes who want nothing to do with this. And so as a result, they are not officially on these Dawes Commission rolls, not because they're not a part of these nations, but because they want nothing to do with this. They say, this is the U.S. government doing this. This isn't something we want to be doing. And so for that reason and many others, these Dawes Commission records are certainly incomplete and, troublesome when we think about what that really means. For Black Indigenous people, they do something a little different. So you have the overall citizenship rolls. So the Cherokee Nation has its citizenship rolls. The Choctaw Nation, they have their citizenship rolls. And then you would have separate freedmen rolls for people who were enslaved by members of the five civilized tribes or are descendants of people who had been enslaved by the tribes. And so the process here is somewhat similar. These freedmen have to go before the Dawes Commission and testify on their own behalf, say, hello, I am, Fannie Love, I am, Lucinda Davis, and I was enslaved by this person who was a member of the Chickasaw Nation, and, I was enslaved by them since I was born and such and such. Then you can also bring in witnesses who can say, yes, I remember I lived next door to her for 20 years, and I know she was enslaved by this person. And so you bring in your witnesses. And then you also have these various kinds of testimony. That could be paperwork like marriage records, baptismal records, etc. And so if you kind of pass muster, then you are put on these freedmen rolls. So you have the official, five civilized tribes, nation rolls, citizenship rolls. Then you have these separate freedmen rolls for the formerly enslaved members of the five civilized tribes.
I'm very curious to know your sourcing for any of the anecdotes about the testimonies and whatnot.
So what is very helpful and what was very helpful for my research is that the Dawes Commission records are actually available digitally. They are on Ancestry.com and various other places, I'm sure. And so they've been digitized and they are readily available for those who are interested. And so I was able to access these records and read the actual testimony of freedmen and others and them really telling their story. So this isn't only interesting because of, kind of its connection to this history of the five civilized tribes, but it's just interesting to hear these people's personal stories, to hear them say, yes, I was born around such and such time. This person was my master. this is who I married. I married this woman who, was from the United States and she's my wife, or I am from such and such place and I married this person from Texas and these are my children and I want them enrolled. And I remember when the war happened and such happened. So it's just people of African descent and indigenous, heritage telling their stories. And so it's this really rich resource that we have available to us where we can just get a window into the lives of these people. And so, again, I just encourage people who are interested just to seek out those Dawes Commission records on Ancestry.com or other sites and just get that firsthand account of what people are experiencing and what they're able to tell about their own histories.
Fascinating. All right. Beginning on page 158, you talk about Cornelius King, the only member of the 5 civilized tribes on the Dawes Commission. So how was his role on the commission unique? That is, what was his duty versus others on the commission? How did he secure his position on the commission? And please also talk about the state of his Cherokee citizenship.
Okay. So Cornelius King is one of those very interesting figures who I wish I could just kind of do 10 pages just about him. And actually, I had a much longer section about him in the book during one of the earlier versions of the book, but I had to cut a lot of that out just for the sake of the narrative. So he, in 1894, gets appointed to the Dawes Commission to serve as it's described in several ways. Sometimes it's described as him being a liaison man, as a porter, as someone who was just serving members on the Dawes Commission. So this happens in 1894. So previous to that, he was, Black Cherokee, and he is in Indian Territory, and he is there when Bishop Henry McNeil Turner is the bishop over the region. And during one of the annual conference meetings, Bishop Turner brings his daughter, Lincolnia Victoria Turner, with him. And she and Cornelius King meet, and they eventually get married. And so this is in the 1880s. And so Cornelius King and, Lincolnia Victoria, they move to Atlanta, which is where Bishop Turner is headquartered. And he does, a variety of jobs there. One of his jobs puts him in close contact with a man named Hoke Smith. And Hoke Smith, who has a law office. And eventually, Hoke Smith becomes the Secretary of the Interior. And it's in that position that Hoke Smith remembers Cornelius King and appoints him to the Dawes Commission in 1894. And so Cornelius King serves in this position for 3 years. And again, exactly what he does is not fully clear. He's described as a liaison man, implying that he is kind of going back and forth between the Dawes Commission and, the freedmen and, explaining their grievances. That's what's implied in that term. But he's also described as a porter and a waiter, which also implies that he was doing just kind of everyday services for members of the Dawes Commission.
Okay. All right.
And okay. I've got the other part of your question, which is about his Cherokee citizenship. So again, he serves in that role for 3 years and then, kind of goes about his business. Then in 1901, he publishes an article about his role in the Dawes Commission and, talks about the complexities of that, being a person of African descent and indigenous descent, and how he, explained the fact that he was a part of this commission, that he had spent enough time among politicians to know that whether the 5 tribes wanted it or not, allotment policy was going to happen, and that the best you could do is to get the best deal you could. And so that was kind of the point of view that he brought to the Dawes Commission while he was serving in that capacity. So then a few years later, he applies himself for citizenship, for Cherokee citizenship. He does not apply under the Freedmen rolls, which, as I explained, were for the descendants of enslaved people. He applies on the Cherokee Nation regular citizenship rolls, and he's denied. He's denied because they say that his mother, from whom he claimed descent, that she was not on previous citizenship rolls, that, they couldn't find her. So it's kind of a great irony that on the one hand, he served on the Dawes Commission in this capacity, but then is later denied. I wonder if he had applied under the Freedmen rolls, if he would have been accepted or not. We just don't know. But he was denied later on. So it is certainly a great irony of his story.
Okay. All right. Well, staying here, you have a section entitled Dennis Barrows, James Fletcher Morris, and the Dawes Commission, beginning on page 168. So, what were the origins of such organizations as the Choctaw Colored Citizens Association and the Chickasaw Freedmen's Association? So that's the first question. Then what role did AMEs play in these organizations, and how did they interact with the Dawes Commission?
These organizations come about really because the freedmen are wanting to ensure that as the Dawes Commission is doing its work and they have this audience with these representatives from the government, that they ensure that their desires, needs, and wants are being heard. So they are, putting together proposals and explaining their grievances that, we have not, although we were supposed to get citizenship in the 1866 treaties, we haven't really gotten that. And we want to make sure that this doesn't happen. We want to make sure we can get access to land. And so they really use these organizations to speak out about what they need and what they want. And so I mentioned it and I talked about it a bit in a previous chapter when we talked about chapter 5. But by this time, numerous AME ministers have married Black Indigenous women. And so as a result, they have become integrated into these communities through their spouses and then through their children. And so this happens in the case of Dennis Barrows, for example. So he has married a Black Indigenous woman and they have children who are now eligible to be enrolled on the Freedmen rolls. And so Dennis Barrows, this AME minister, who is now integrated into these communities, he ends up serving a leadership role in this Freedmen organization, because not only is he representing them because he is an AME minister and he's looking out for them, but because he now has a personal vested interest in the success of these organizations because of his wife and because of his children. So this is just one example of how it's so important that these AMEs have become integrated into these communities over so many decades. So the Indian Mission Annual Conference is established in 1879. So by the time we get to this Dawes Commission era, they've been there for a good bit of time. And so as chapter 6 highlighted, they've established churches and schools and had publications and just really become a part of these places and these people. And so Dennis Barrows, James Fletcher Morris, because they take it kind of a step further and really intermarry into these communities, they have this vested interest in their success. And we see that with them participating in these freedmen organizations and really advocating on behalf of freedmen themselves.
We're going to stay here. A committee of Dennis Barrows, Wesley McKinney, and E.D. Colbert wrote the Memorial of the Choctaw Colored Citizens Association to the Dawes Commission, first mentioned on page 163. In this document, the men argue the need for freedmen's rights and fair recompense. They also compared the plight of Native Americans with African Americans, saying that at least African Americans earned rights from the 14th Amendment. So my question is this a fair argument?
The issue that a lot of these freedmen are having is that they were supposed to have gotten citizenship in the tribes in the 1866 treaties that we talked about previously. And they felt that they were not getting the support and assistance and respect that they were due. And they felt, and they made the assessment, that for African Americans who had gained citizenship with the 14th Amendment, maybe they're, better off than we are. So the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal protection of the laws and also establishes the concept of birthright citizenship. So people born in the United States, regardless of their, race, they are automatically citizens. That does not initially apply to Native people who have their own sovereign tribal governments. So for the freedmen who are under these, 5 civilized tribes, for them, the 14th Amendment does not quite apply. And so, these freedmen are making this judgment that, here we are, in many ways similar to our African American brothers and sisters, but yet they have citizenship rights and we do not. And that is uneven, and that is not true to the spirit of what, certainly Reconstruction was about and what, these amendments were about. And that needs to be addressed. And so they are making that very crucial point and pushing for their citizenship rights within the tribes as they feel they are due, as should have been done because of the 1866 treaties. And they also point out in that memorial quite pointedly that, don't you remember that the governments of the Choctaw Nation, the governments of the 5 civilized tribes sided with the Confederacy? Don't you remember that? And we're the ones who've been loyal and we are being treated this way. And so they really try to pull out all the stops to point out the ways in which they feel their rights are not being fully recognized and realized, and view that as quite unfair. And so are appealing to the Dawes Commission in whatever ways that they can.
Thank you. All right. In your section entitled The AME Church Aids in Citizenship Cases, beginning on page 167, you explain that AME ministers participated in tribal citizenship cases. In what ways were they helpful? You offer several anecdotes in the book. Please share one that stands out. And how did marriage licenses help in citizenship applications?
Okay. So this section really is the culmination of everything we've seen in the previous chapters, that you've had these decades of AMEs being in these communities, sometimes intermarrying into these communities, performing marriages, performing baptisms, burying folks, so that by the time you get to the Dawes Commission era, these ministers can actually speak up for, testify for, be witnesses for, provide evidence for these freedmen to help in their citizenship cases. One of the best examples that I found is an AME minister named Albert Alexander Sears. And he had a habit, he had a practice of, he had this big ledger book that he kept, in which he kept track of the birth, marriages, and deaths of all of his parishioners. And so he had, these records for all of his members. And so people would use those. They would use, parts of that for their citizenship cases. So sometimes he would come and he would testify physically on their behalf. So there's a case of him doing that for Fannie Love and her deceased daughter, Susie Love. So he comes and he testifies in Chakotah, Oklahoma, saying that, yes, I know Fannie Love. She's a member of mine. I was on my way to conference one time, and I remember I saw her and I saw her daughter. And so he physically comes to support their cases. And then sometimes he physically brings, parts of his ledger book to show Dawes commissioners that, yeah, I have the marriage records here. I have the, the death date here. And so that helps in these citizenship cases. So also marriage records. We have ministers who have been performing marriages for however long, and these help to prove the relationships between people, and they can be used to help validate, the births of their children, that yes, we are in a marriage and we have had this child, and so this child should be an official member of the tribe as well. And so all of these records really serve to aid these freedmen in their cases. And oftentimes it really does help, not only having AME ministers show up in person, but also providing these records And sometimes if the people have lost the records, they will reference the ministers they remember. I remember one case where several people were witnesses who said, yes, I don't have the form, but I remember it was a preacher named Sisson who came. It was, I believe he was a white man, but yes, he was an AME minister, and he came and performed the ceremony. So if you recall, Sisson refers to James Fitzallen Sisson, who we discussed in the fifth podcast in chapter 5, who was a white minister from Massachusetts, who becomes an AME minister and plays an important role in the Indian Mission Annual Conference. So several people referenced and remembered Preacher Sisson, who had performed their marriages. So when they didn't have their physical copies of a marriage record, they could refer to the minister who would help to validate that. And so again, these AME ministers and the work they've been putting in for decades really ends up being very helpful for freedmen in their citizenship cases before the Dawes Commission.
All right. Okay. So what is remarkable about Simon Keel's land allotment? Did he get what he was owed? And how did he fare compared to other freedmen? And what role did the AME Church play in his gained allotment?
Simon Keel was able to get an allotment because of his successful application for citizenship, and he was already improving the land that he later got officially allotted. And he was able to really have decades of continuous land ownership of this allotment. So by 1930, he is still living there. He has several children. And so the fact that this man was able to have such a sustained period of land ownership in this time period, where this was virtually an impossibility for many African Americans in the South, is pretty remarkable. And it shows the opportunity that was opened for Black Indigenous people, this opportunity for land ownership and land possession. And so the fact, of course, his hard work enabled this to become prosperous enough so that he could remain on there and then have his children be there as well. But this also, again, just shows how Black Indigenous people took, very difficult circumstances and took advantage of, the opportunity as best they could. And he, in his citizenship application, referenced his, connection to the AME Church. And so that also is, indicative of how important that was to his general, identity. And so it's really a remarkable story and helps to encapsulate what really has happened with the AME Church and its presence in Indian Territory and the importance that it had for Black Indigenous people.
All right. Well, that's it for chapter 7. I'd like to know some big picture thoughts and takeaways on the chapter.
Well, what I hope people take away from this chapter is an understanding that all the efforts that AMEs put in that we looked at in chapter 6, it really comes to fruition in chapter 7. All the labor that AMEs had done over decades enabled them to then be of service to Black Indigenous people during the Dawes Commission era, helping them with their citizenship cases and ultimately, in doing so, enabling them to acquire their land allotments and hopefully a future in which they and their families could have a more stable time. And so chapter 7, again, is really the culmination of what we've seen in the past several chapters, especially chapter 6. And so it's, really interesting in terms of the personal stories that I'm able to share and the work that I was able to put forward with these Dawes Commission records. So again, I encourage people to look at those themselves and the personal testimonies, because they really tell a rather remarkable story that we often don't hear about in African American history in general.
Awesome. All right. Well, that is chapter 7. That is the final chapter. We will have one more podcast about big picture takeaways about the book. So I look forward to that. In the meantime, thank you. And I'll see you then.
Thanks so much. See you then.